how could such an entity really find a way to sort of get a foothold in the system? Even Belarus, Svetlana Tsarnaenko, if I say her name correctly,
Yep.
There's a clear sort of leadership candidate, right? Whether or not you like her as a person. Russia, there is none. So how do you perceive that?
A lot of the Russian people, actively or passively, condone what Putin's doing in Russia. They are afraid, or they've learned to actually keep their heads down and let it all blow over. Now, so I think there's three reasons why you've got Russian opposition in exile. One is to articulate those things to Russians and actually explain the future different, not to make it all about Putin, because Putin will die, but actually to look beyond Putin. Secondly, I think it's to focus the various groups. There's huge numbers of groups now in exile, very fragmented.
This is the Global Gambit.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned Shoigu. I can't help but roll my eyes. I mean, of all the people in Putin's inner circle, I find him just an incompetent idiot, to be honest with you.
Yeah, he's great. I met him, actually.
He's drunk, so...
Yeah, I met Shoigu. He's the great survivor of Russian politics. He was keen to point out to us that he was the first minister in the late Soviet period. Then he became Minister of Emergency, and the Minister of Defence. He's used every step to enrich himself and those around him. So the people who've been arrested in the Ministry of Defence came with him from the Ministry of Emergencies, and they're the people under arrest now. Not he himself, but I think the noose is getting tight around his neck. But I think more widely, he's an example that corruption is acceptable by Putin within certain limits, and when corruption goes beyond acceptable, i.e. in the military in wartime, he'll step in and do something about it. So I don't think that process of arrests and purging has finished. Of course, it'll be interesting to see how much further it goes actually into the military itself rather than just the Ministry of Defence.
Naturally, we had this reshuffle, if you like, earlier this year, which was the first one in about 10 years. But I'm curious for your perspective of the installation of Belousov, Andrei Belousov, finance guy, as the new defense minister, and obviously how he plays into sort of trying to manage the wartime economy. I believe the Russians are now going to be spending, about 140, 50 billion of their money on the military, which is obviously a sizable increase, still a fraction of the US, or still behind China by about 100 billion, I think. What's your take there? Is that just about normalizing the expenditure and trying to keep it, in the good views of the Russian public, or it's not so much about that?
He's been brought in because he's a money guy, and he's absolutely fiercely loyal, sort of apparatchik, technocrat. He's been brought in by Putin to the Ministry of Defence to, quote, sort it out because of the corruption under Shoigu. And that's why I think the purging of the ministers and senior officials has followed his appointment. You've seen him go into factories and threaten people with repercussions if they don't deliver on what the contracts they've been to do. So he's been there to put the fear of God into the system, as a quote, safe pair of hands. Now, he doesn't have any military experience at all. There was a picture of him wearing a military uniform, which everybody laughed at. So I think, he's going to be much less sort of preening himself, wearing medals, awarding himself medals like Shoigu was, sitting on top of tanks and looking magnificent. Because Shoigu is both corrupt and monstrously vain and incompetent. Belousov doesn't have the same degree of personal vanity, and by all accounts, he's not particularly corrupt by the Russian standards. So you have to see how it works. Now, his problem he's got, of course, is the whole system, both Ministry of Defence and military, is very good at getting around new ministers. They've got decades, if not centuries, of ways to hide where the money's going, because everybody's on the take at every level, down to unit commanders at the front, all the way through to ministers and generals. So everybody's got their fingers in the pie. Can you get the fingers out of the pie and actually devote more resources, more bang for buck, as I put it once, towards the front? Or will he also struggle with a sort of bureaucratic obstructionism, which many other ministers in Russia suffer from?
Indeed. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more, but prior to us having the conversation, we were discussing this interesting point you made about the fragmented or disjointed Russian opposition. in that not the opposition, the systemic opposition within Russian government or parliament, but the, shall we say, expats, the exiled. Could you break down a little bit more for people exactly who that means and how you think it's fragmented, or what you meant by these sort of things? Because that was quite an interest to me. I didn't know there was such a opposition, to be honest.
Who call themselves the Russian opposition in the West, and I think they come from a number of different circles, different communities. You've got the sort of ones who left in the 90s and 2000s and made exile. People like Kasparov and Korokovsky, obviously was in prison for 10 years, and Berezovsky, people like that, Berezovsky, in the past. And they were the sort of, shall we say, the traditional opposition of dealings with the system and fell foul of it. And now you have a younger generation, post-Soviet generation, much younger, people like Navalny and the people around him, Yashin, Kurmuzar, who come sort of to the West, and they're now, who are in prison, and they've come to the West in exile, and now everybody's trying to sort out the Russian opposition. Now, the last 2 or 3 years, one part of the Russian opposition has been holding these forums about the future of Russia without the participation of the other part, which is fine, because actually infighting the Russian opposition goes back hundreds of years. And if you read about all the exiles under Tsarist periods and Soviet periods, it's exactly the same. They tend to be quite squabbly. Everyone wants to be in charge and not very good at establishing ideas about the future of Russia. And of course, they're outside, and it's hard to influence what goes on inside. I mean, what's caused the latest disagreement, I would politely call it, is the accusations by the Navalny team that one of their senior members was assaulted by representatives of the other part of the opposition, which has caused a massive rupture, which I think is more really because Putin wants people in exile to be squabbling, because the more they squabble in exile, the less they have actually ability to influence the situation in Russia. And I think also their squabbling reflects uncertainty about their actual influence and actual popularity in Russia, how much they can actually be a real opposition, or we just have to wait Putin till he dies and they'll deal with whoever comes next. So my point about that was that the Russian opposition could get its act together and work together. I would hope they could come up with some ideas about the future of Russia as it is, not the sort of, imagine just taking Western nostrums of democracy and freedom and trying to parachute them onto Russia, because Russia's a deeply damaged society. But in the meantime, we in the West will just have to contain Russia, because I think that the problem of the Russian opposition actually dislike a large number of their own population, and they don't understand it. They're quite urban, and Russia is more than just the major urban centres.
So I've got a related question to sort of post-Putinism in a second, but one of the things, a precursor to that, one of the things that I hear often from, shall we say, hardline supporters of Ukraine, NATO related, not labeling it all, blanketing it all, but people who want to see the fragmentation, the Balkanization of Russia. So I'm curious, sort of as a two-pronged question. One, do you think that that's realistic? And two, would you want to see such a thing like that happen?
On the realism of it, no. I think there's a huge... I think Russia's managed to maintain a large empire of multiple nationalities for centuries successfully. And there's not many alternative senses of power. So I think the practicalities or realism of it, I'm in doubt of, to be honest. I think there's not a huge amount of actual antipathy towards instability, which would be the result of a breakup of Russia into its constituent parts, whatever those constituent parts are. I mean, I think secondly on the desirability, I think the breakup of Russia would make the breakup of Yugoslavia look like a children's picnic. But that, you've got the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So if we were horrified what happened in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, which I was at ships off, horrified by what was going on between the various parties and the atrocities, imagine that 100-fold, because of all the various inter-ethnic and inter-community tensions inside Russia, which the Russian state managed to keep a lid on, which break out regularly. So a breakup of Russia is not in, I don't think, the UK's interest. And coupled that with keeping control of the world's largest nuclear arsenal and the risk of proliferation makes that even more so.
Yeah, you make me think of the 90s film where there's that discussion. I think it's got George Clooney in it. And he's like some, typical sort of American like guy who's, going for it. But this whole idea that a rebel entity or a non-state actor, an anarchist group could get hold of a warhead in a sort of anarchic situation within Russia, and the whole situation goes, mental. I, for one, have different perspectives as to why I'm not really on the side of a Balkanization of Russia, the overall destabilization of international security being one. So I could see sort of, breakaway provinces like Dagestan or Chechnya maybe, but the overall sort of dissolution of the entire Russian Federation, I'm not entirely sure the reasonability of that. But to follow on, I think
that's interesting. Just very quickly, I was in, as you know, I was in Washington last week. I was having dinner with a friend of mine, American military diplomat, who also worked for the Defence Threat Reduction Agency, the DTRA, DETRA, which invested huge amounts of money.
So it's a
huge. It's part of the DoD. It was there to do technical work to reduce risk of proliferation. So it's not just the warheads and security. That's important. But it's also the scientists and the know-how. And investment into alternative skills training. And they put Americans put billions of dollars into Russia to reduce that risk. So they did that for a reason, because the same reason they didn't want to see Russian A break up, or B, they didn't want to see it break up. This sort of risk of, say, proliferation. So I've watched that George Clooney film, but I think it's more the know-how and also working between places like Iran and North Korea, those sort of countries, which we don't want to become greater nuclear states.
No, for sure.
I agree with your point about destabilization, the wider international order. So a 140 million person bloodbath. As I said, if you imagine how much time the breakup of Yugoslavia consumed in European security discussions in the 1990s, and say times that by 100.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just, I think it's the fallout, unprecedented fallout. If anything were to go crazy in Russia, how many countries would be seeking to literally make land grabs? The Chinese, I'm thinking particularly around Manchuria and just whole eastern part of Siberia is up for grabs. But bringing
I think it's an elegant parlor game. So very quickly, I think it's an elegant parlor game, which people they like to think that they want to wish Russia away. If Russia wasn't there because it broke up, therefore it would be less of a problem. But I think that's unrealistic and naive. There's very strong reasons why Russia would stay together. And actually, of course, we've had these. They've managed to ride the horse of all these various groups and ethnicities and regional identities successfully from Moscow. And that's why the Russian state exists so centrally, is because the land is so unruly. So there's an awful lot of reasons why these sort of centrifugal forces would be countered by centripetal forces in Moscow to maintain the status quo. So I think, let's not waste too much time on it. Let's deal with it, understand Russia as it is, not as we wish it to be.
Yeah, well put. I think also it's something that, I host a lot of people on the show, and whilst I agree with much of what they say, I disagree on elements. And I do think that this idea that there isn't a Russian identity, it's false. Maybe whether or not you think it's fake because of its relationship to Ukraine, and people again will perhaps disagree with my perspective on that. But I do think that there is a Russian identity to an extent. It's a pretty broad one, obviously, given the ethnic diversity and just the sheer geographical size and stuff. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an identity nonetheless. But we can go back and forth on that, and obviously we can have a deeper dive, have you back on as many times as we need to debate it, if you like. But I want to bring it also closer to home, because one of the things, when we're talking about a hypothetical exiled opposition, right, the whole discussion point or talking point is that how could such an entity really find a way to sort of get a foothold in the system? I'm thinking of countries like Venezuela right now. We've just had an election there. I've just released a video at the time of this recording with Phil Gunson of the International Crisis Group, And, this main argument is that it's really hard in 2019. There was a lot of international pressure trying to force Maduro out and to input the Juan Guaido, I think his surname, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
This time there is no appetite because the US is distracted on two main fronts, 2.5 if you want to count looming Taiwan. China and Russia are more emboldened, and there's a lot more instability just generally. So whilst we want to, verbally, we say that we condemn and we support the Venezuelan people for their right to democracy, there's very actual little effort to follow through on that. And the guy who Gonzalez, who ran against Maduro, he's now exiled in Spain. So why I'm using this as an example is because I think it's very, very applicable as a case study for Russia, right? You've got no clear figurehead. You've got no clear approach to even Belarus, Svetlana Tsarnaenko, if I say her name correctly.
Yep.
There's a clear sort of leadership candidate, right? Whether or not you like her as a person. Russia, there is none. So how do you perceive that? Right? Does what I say make sense, or is it?
I think you're right. I think obviously the murder of political opponents by the Russian state, was a deliberate attempt to decapitate the opposition. Particularly, I think people like Nemtsov. Because I think Nemtsov was a character who had charisma and was very Russian, but I think B, he actually had government experience. So he was a sort of a man of the system could articulate who had seen the potential for and could articulate an alternative future. I think Navalny's rise came after them, basically after the rise of Nemtsov, but he was a different character. Of course, now he's gone. So who do you have left, as you say? So you don't have I think they are leaderless. Although many people would like to be in the lead, but that's the other problem. Nobody's willing to compromise between. So I think, secondly, there's lots of abstract ideas, which is very similar to what happened in the 19th century. Because of they would offer, quote, vague panaceas, would tend to be uncompromising and like to prefer to settle accounts rather than deal with the future. So they had these vague panaceas like, Russia's going to become a democracy, and they'll all move on. I think the third thing is this battle of ideas is to talk to the Russian people. I mean, I read Mr. Kolkovsky's manifesto, review of his book, and one of the criticisms of the book was there was nothing to do with actually reaching out to the Russian people. It was actually power will be transferred amongst the elites, and then we will deal with the new elite, rather than articulating this idea of a future Russia to the Russian people. Now, a lot of the Russian people actively or passively condone what Putin's doing in Russia. They are afraid, or they've learned to actually keep their heads down and let it all blow over. So how do you reach that number of people? Because actually the other problem the Russian opposition's got is many of them aren't known in Russia, and those who were known have been killed. So that is the problem. Now, so I think there's three reasons why you've got Russian opposition in exile. One is to articulate those things to Russians and actually explain a different future, not to make it all about Putin, because Putin will die, but actually to look beyond Putin. Secondly, I think it's to focus the various groups. There's huge numbers of groups now in exile, very fragmented. Now, I'm not saying you have one massive structure, but there must be a way of bringing them together for discussions. And I think thirdly, it helps us understand state and the political structures from those who've actually dealt with it. So I would hope that over time the Russian opposition gets their act together, stops the squabbling, starts working together, moves away from universal solutions to actually practicalities based on the Russian situation. I think that's the problem Russia's got. It's never had any democracy whatsoever at all. And Poland had it, and the Baltics, those countries had some form of experience of democracy, representative democracy. Russia's had very, very limited, 1917 between February and October revolutions, or briefly in the early 1990s, but that was quickly crushed when Mr. Yeltsin shelled the White House and established presidential rule. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It is hard. I think your point about previous diasporas or exiles, Iran, 1979, Cuba, 1960s, 50s, sorry, Venezuela, even Russia itself. There's lots of the Russian opposition has to look at those lessons, otherwise they'll become as equally irrelevant to the countries they love.
I think part of the reason why Putin's been so popular amongst Russians is because they've not had anything else to compare him with other than a drunken Yeltsin, who was an embarrassment for Russian pride and presentation on the international sphere. People have come to believe.
I think it's also the fear of. Sorry, that he plays on the fear of instability, the smooter. He plays on that things will break up. Secondly, he's quite adept at portraying the problems of Russia as being caused by the West, outsiders, and also he doesn't place great demands ideologically on them. So if you keep your head down as a Russian, and don't protest, then you can get on with your life. I mean, that's been historically. Those who protest are going to be dealt with harshly. So that sort of creates a sort of fear and a sort of dissuades other people from stepping forward. So I'm not convinced by the argument that all Russians are lockstep behind Putin, that every Russian is at fault, but I think enough Russians support the war and the current situation, the current system, which is going to be very hard to break down while Mr. Putin's there. Now, what happens up next when he finally dies is all up for grabs.
Well, certainly, I think it goes without saying that he has a predatorial character and has preyed upon Russian insecurities and his propaganda machine that he's installed over his entire tenure as quote unquote president is unrivaled. That's why he's seen by so many other strongmen as the strongman, and I think that his ability to control information means that even if there is skepticism amongst some Russians, they're still too afraid to admit it. And the lowest his ever support has gone down to is 55-58%. So it's that would be great for a politician in the West, but as a strongman, that's a terrifying figure. But put it on its head. What about Navalny? I mean, he's not exactly. I'm going to be blunt that I never saw him as a candidate to be a competent leader or replacement. He had some pretty bad skeletons in his closet. I know he tried to address them with his ultra-nationalist statements and tendencies, but this whole idea that he could have been the leader of some opposition, I just don't. I mean,
obviously, I don't want to speak ill of the dead. He died. And I thought his return to Russia was an act of extreme political courage, because he could have stayed in exile. But he realised that to change Russia, you have to be on the inside, change it for the better. And I thought that his writings and his thinking before his death showed a shift towards, should we say, more normal manifesto for better Russia, better, happy itself, which I think has resonance. But his methods were not. Obviously, he got the clamp down. He wasn't allowed to stand for election. He had a large degree of support in many areas, but as we saw during his funeral. But if they're now concentrating with the movement, what's left of it is basically on anti-corruption and pointing out the system which they were working within as part of the smart voting. So I think, again, the Navalny crew haven't refused to engage with the other crew since before and since Mr. Navalny's death. And now, as I said, the relationship's got even worse. So although Mrs. Navalny portrays herself as the leader, quote unquote, of the Russian opposition, she is by no means that. And I think foreign politicians who fate her and others like her are making a mistake, because they've got to understand the Russian emigre community as a whole, and not just one part of it.
I guess the last question, really, as we conclude this epic, or shall we say, roller coaster of a journey, is okay. So, what does well, it's the same question I've asked before to people, but what does a post-Putin Russia look like then? I mean, let's be realistic that it's not going to happen for the foreseeable future, just because whether or not we like to say that there are times when he looks delicate or his position is precarious. The mutiny obviously comes to mind, but ultimately he has undertaken his mini purges. So it's just a case of we have to continue managing with this individual in place, and anyone other than him would be worse. I think of is it Vladimir Zhirinovsky, right, the former head of the LDP party, when he died in June, I think it was, of 22. Putin went to his funeral, but people who aren't familiar with Zhirinovsky will not realize that the guy was, if anything, even more extreme, or wanted to do more extreme things than Putin was doing in the early days of the war, just the whole war, right? Does that make sense?
On the current stability or not of the regime, I think it's stronger than it looks. Every time, as I said, an event happens, people use the word surely this time. Surely the Russians will come to their senses. Putin has been humiliated. He's been shaken. He's been shocked, and it's only a matter of time until he's kicked out. But then, then he basically regroups and carries on. He uses the same tactics of just basically disappearing, setting the situation, and then moving on. So that's what he did with Prigozhin. That's what he did after Kursk. As I said, I think there is pressure with the system, but he probably judges it's manageable. There's no pressure from the public. We've discussed that. And also there's no pressure from the elites, because the question you have to consider is who would replace him. If they move against him, who do they rally around? If you start a coup, you better work out who the beneficiary of that coup is, rather than just descending into fighting. So he's managed to divide and rule. Even people like Duymin or whatever, kept at arm's length. He's not the Bonaparte, what's he called? He's not the Henry IV Bolingbroke sort of character who's going to come back and oust him. So he's been quite careful on that. So I think, if we look at that, then it strikes me that the post-Putin situation will be a transfer of power within the elite, rather than any great big street demonstrations. That's not to say that events could possibly crop up and lead to a mass uprising, but actually I find the talk of a mass protest unlikely, given the degree of control the Russian security services and army have got over the people now, and the press, and the control of information. So what does that mean? It means if Putin goes, somebody maybe younger, somebody who shares his worldview, but maybe not so extreme, somebody who's maybe more willing to do business may emerge. But you have to remember, after Brezhnev, it was Andropov. After Andropov, it was Chernenko. And after Chernenko, it was Gorbachev. And then only after that did Yeltsin come along for a brief period, and then quickly descended back into, under Mr. Putin. So we have to be careful what we wish for.
Wise words to end this conversation with, I think, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. John Foreman, CBE, former Defence Attache to Kiev and Moscow, most recent British Defence Attache. I should also put in double underscore, because it's the most recent in-person perspective we've got. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Piotr.
If you enjoyed the conversation, we'll be sure to have John back. I think there's a lot more to explore here, and I look forward to it. Maybe we can have you back to think about some of the more recent developments. But otherwise, everyone, check out the channel. There's lots more to discuss, lots more to view, and I'll see you all in a future one. And as always, I wish you peace of mind. Take care.